Within photography, there are a lot of sayings that are often being presented as facts or a rule, and they're just being repeated again and again and again. But in the end, they are simply just nonsense, and we'll be better off if we simply just stop saying it. Also, as you can see, I am back in Iceland, and it is absolutely gorgeous. So the first thing I consider to be photography nonsense is how we distinguish between horizontal photos and vertical photos as landscape format and portrait format. The problem is that people start associating vertical photos with portrait photography and obviously horizontal photos with landscape photography. The problem is that you can get the idea that if you take a landscape photo in vertical format or a portrait photo in horizontal format, it may be wrong. And in the end, it's actually just nonsense, because obviously, as you can see here with these recent photos I've taken on this journey here in Iceland, you can definitely take vertical photos when you're doing landscape photography. Likewise, in the early days of my photography career, I did a whole lot of horizontal portrait photos. I personally think that it gives a lot more breathing room around the person, so it doesn't feel as if the person is like crammed in there and all you see is like the face. I sometimes hear at best pseudo-scientific explanations why landscape photos are better in horizontal format, and it's because of our peripheral vision that we see the world wide and not elongated. The shape of your photo should obviously be dictated by what you want to include from the scene in front of you, how you want to present it. The purpose of the photo is also worth considering. Are you only taking photos for Instagram? Yes, vertical format is way to go. If you're more into making big prints, then definitely consider making them big and wide for the wall. However, if you have a slim wall, then maybe the portrait or vertical format is better. And obviously, it also in the end comes down to personal preference. So I think that talking about portrait format and landscape format is nonsense, and we should just call it vertical or horizontal format. And then there's of course also square format, but that's another talk. If you want to learn how I compose photos like this, when I think about framing and scale, whether to use a horizontal or vertical format, how I use leading lines, balance my photos, and much more, be sure to get my 2 ebooks. They're super easy to read with minimal text and loads of photo examples to get to the point fast. There are links to both of them down in the description of this video. So I've arrived here at one of the big glaciers in Iceland, and I want to take a photo where we have little me in the foreground and we have the big epic backdrop of the glacier. However, we have a little bit of an issue, and that is if I shoot wide angle, I'm taking in way too much of the scene right here. So I need to zoom in a little bit, and then you can easier see me, and you can also see the glacier way further up close. It takes up more of the image. Now, to get a photo like that, I need to use what's called perspective compression. Perspective compression is that you move your camera into a position so that your perspective makes the scene epic, and then you use the focal length that is optimal for the scene. Now, I often hear this term as lens compression, and it's a confusing term. It's actually a little bit of nonsense because it has nothing to do with the lens. Yes, you do need a specific focal length to optimally photograph the specific scene you're photographing in, but it is your perspective relative to the scene in front of you that makes the difference, and therefore it ought to be called perspective compression. So, to get such an epic shot with me in the front and the glacier in the background, I will need to change my perspective. That is why we should call it perspective compression and not lens compression. It has nothing to do with the lens. Just look here. So right now I found my composition. I know I want to include this much of the glacier. However, I don't really have a place to stand right down here. I could walk all the way down to this group right there, but that would not have me included in the photo. I can of course zoom a little bit out if I want to, but it's not really the composition that I want. So what I need to do is to walk away from this place where I'm standing here and walk up here. And as you can see, I am shooting at about 70 millimeter. And the point here is I need to change my perspective, not the lens. Alrighty, so I now made it up the hill and the perspective has changed in the scene. So right now, as you can see, my composition is like this, and I'm still shooting at about 70 millimeter. But since I've changed my perspective, I now have a completely different scene where I can walk into it and walk on that ridge and get my perspective compressed photo, not lens compressed.
A misunderstanding I often hear is that you need a telephoto lens to create this effect, but using a longer focal length, the same as zooming in, only crops your field of view. It does not compress the scene. I also took a wide-angle photo of this same scene, and as you can see, I can perfectly overlay the zoomed-in photo with the zoomed out, proving that the lens does not change the perspective. What some people may think the lens can do is something along the lines of the dolly effect from videography. Here we see how the scene is getting compressed because I am moving both the camera, the perspective, and zooming at the same time. But the compression effect happens because I move the camera, not because I change the field of view. It's kind of an optical illusion the brain makes on you because I remove your spatial awareness by zooming in, by cropping your field of view.
So the next nonsense I think we should stop saying is that you need to expose to the left or you need to underexpose because it's easier to recover the shadows than it is recovering the highlights. Yes, you can blow the highlights, but you can most certainly also blow the shadows. And there aren't as much detail in those underexposed shadows as you would want to think there is. Yes, these days we do have amazing noise reduction software, but you still need to just make a proper exposure. It's actually really that simple. So as I've explained in other videos, you need to expose to the right, but you do not want to clip the highlights. Overexposing the photo and clipping the highlights are two different things. You can most certainly overexpose a photo and then bring down all that information in post-processing. So you actually do want to overexpose the photo, but you do not want to clip the highlights. And it's very important that we put those two things together in the same sentence. Overexpose, but don't clip the highlights. Because then you actually get more information onto your sensor. You can then bring it down in post-processing and you then have a cleaner photo. So I've come here to the ice beach in Iceland. One of the most beautiful and unique places in the entire world to take landscape photos. And to get a proper exposure is very, very simple. So right now I am photographing in manual mode. So I take control of all my settings, both the shutter speed, the ISO and the aperture. And let's say I want to photograph this chunk of ice right here in front of me. So I simply just dial in with my histogram here so that I get a proper exposure. So if we look here at the histogram right now, I'm overexposing. As you can see, I also have my zebra stripes here warning me. So I need to just make a proper exposure. I have a few zebra stripes, but up here that is fine. And now I'm good. I can change the ISO of course, but then I start overexposing again. You just want to fill out your histogram right here so that your information is towards the right. You can also see I have information here towards the left. That's the black sand you can see here in front of us. And the information on the right, that is the background and the sky. There's no right or wrong histogram. There's just an optimal exposure. And right now, as you can see, as I decrease my shutter speed, I get a darker and darker and darker photo. And obviously, I don't want to underexpose it. Yes, I can bring it up in Photoshop or Lightroom, but then I just get a noisy photo. I just want to make a proper exposure to begin with, which is about here. So underexposing a photo on purpose because it's easier to bring out the shadows is just nonsense. Just get a proper exposure from the beginning. Expose to the right, but don't clip the highlights. It's that simple.
Sometimes you photograph a very contrasty scene, and to not get your shadow area too dark and full of noise when you lift the shadows, you'll want to take two photographs. One where you expose for the shadow areas, in this case the foreground, and one where you expose for the highlights, in this case the sky, and then you can combine them in Photoshop or another editing software that allows you to work with layers. If you do struggle with editing or want to learn my editing techniques such as working with layers, luminosity masks, focus stacking, adding or working with atmosphere, cleaning your photos properly, dodging and burning, and avoiding editing mistakes, then check out my big post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. There are now more than 30 videos divided into several sections, and if you want to save a bit of money, be sure to use the coupon code down in the description of the video.
So the final part I consider to be complete photography nonsense is that wide-angle lenses are landscape lenses. The problem with saying something like that is that you kind of insinuate that the other lenses are not landscape lenses, and obviously that's just plain wrong. On this trip alone, I have taken a few photos with the long lens of the landscapes. Generally in Iceland, there are plenty of ways you can take photos, beautiful photos, with a telephoto and a standard zoom lens. So just right here, where we are standing right now, I'm photographing out here. We have the most incredible sea spray, as you can see down here, right here being lit by the sun, and then we have the background mountains there and a beautiful dramatic sky. It looks absolutely gorgeous. And a wide-angle lens can of course be used to much more than just landscape photography. You can use it to architecture photography, cityscape photography, and you can actually also use it for portraits. Now, it may not be the most flattering portraits. It kind of gets a little bit of a comical look when you take a headshot or a portrait photo with a wide-angle lens, but a wide-angle lens is not exclusively decent or good and can be used for landscape photography. It can be used to a lot of different kinds of photography. Where you have to distinguish between the lenses or focal lengths, that is, that you want to use is simply just how does the scene in front of you look. If it's a big dramatic scene where you need to take in the entire visual field, then yes, a wide-angle lens is good. However, if you need to zoom into like something way into the background or in the near the horizon, far away, or some details, then a telephoto lens is of course beneficial. And if you want to take something in between, then a standard zoom lens is what you want to use. So I hope I managed to clean up a little bit of all this photography nonsense that gets repeated again and again and again. If you want to learn more about composition, or you want to learn how to edit your photos, be sure to use the links down in the description of this video to either get my composition ebooks or enroll in my big Photoshop for Landscape Photographers post-processing course. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time.